All right, how's everybody doing today? Hotep, hey, this is Michael M. Hotep, founder of the African History Network, host of the African History Network show. I'm a talk show host, researcher, lecturer, writer, and historian. So it is Monday, June 20th, 2022. And if you've been watching the African History Network show and watching my broadcast, you know we've been dealing with some of the real history of Juneteenth and separating fact from fiction, okay? And we know that June 20th is the celebration of the actual federal holiday. So a lot of federal buildings are closed, and you have even state offices in 24 states that are shut down, and state workers are getting a paid day off. 26 states are not recognizing the federal holiday. In some of my presentations and lectures I've been doing, I did Juneteenth weekend in the Metro Detroit area. I talked about separating fact from fiction when it deals with the history of Juneteenth. And we dealt with things like why the Emancipation Proclamation did not free the slaves. We dealt with things like it was the 13th Amendment ratified December 6, 1865. Abraham Lincoln had no authority to free the slaves in the South because they had seceded from the Union, etc. So I've been celebrating Juneteenth for about 10 years, been doing lectures for about 10 years. But this presentation here today, I want to deal with something very specific. Juneteenth did not free all Black slaves in Texas. It did not free all African slaves in Texas. And I've talked about this before and in the presentations I did this past weekend, and also media interviews that was done with me leading up to Juneteenth also. We've talked about how some slave owners in Texas kept their African slaves for an additional year, an additional season. Some sources say to get another season's worth of crops harvested and grown and planted, things like this, right? We also know that you're going to have Texas was a safe haven for slave owners. So because there was less of a presence of Union troops in Texas, you're going to have slave owners taking their African slaves from Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas, things like this into Texas, all right? But also was known to a much lesser extent is even though they're going to hold some of the African slaves, so there's approximately 250,000 of them in Texas, okay, not just Galveston, Texas, but in Texas. We know that on June 18th, Major General Gordon Granger arrives at the beach there in Galveston, Texas, with about 2,000 Union troops. Many of them were African-American men, okay, about 2,000 Union troops, many of them African-American men. And they are there to enforce General Order Number 3. Okay, y'all have to bear with me. I'm broadcasting on my smartphone because my laptop died on me Friday, about 10 minutes before I was supposed to do Roland Martin Unfiltered, Roland Martin shows. I had to broadcast his show from my smartphone, and I got to send my laptop to the insurance company tomorrow to see what they can do with it. So I'm crippled without my laptop because I run my business from it and do everything from that. So I'm broadcasting from a smartphone, so just bear with me. So was not talked about a lot is another thing that we're going to deal with in this presentation. Some slave owners did not want to free their enslaved Africans, so they killed them. Some slave owners in Texas did not want to free their enslaved Africans when General Order Number 3 was delivered by Major General Gordon Granger. Now, keep in mind, June 19th was the date agreed upon to celebrate the enslaved Africans there in Galveston, Texas, but in Texas in general, getting the news that the Civil War was over for all practical purposes and that they were free, okay? But Major General Gordon Granger is going to go throughout Texas for almost up to a year, issuing General Order Number 3, and he's there to physically take back control of Texas away from the Confederacy. So it took military enforce General Order Number 3. All right. So number one, Juneteenth did not free all African slaves in Texas. And I talked about this last year, but we're going to go deeper into it here. And I was watching news coverage of Juneteenth, this whole weekend and the week leading up to June 19th. And I was watching news coverage today, and they were saying, this was the last day of slavery in this country. No, it's not. That's absolutely false. That was not the last day of slavery in this country. When we talk about the history of Juneteenth, we have to correct the history of Juneteenth, and we have to protect the history of Juneteenth. If you saw me on Fox Soul TV, the Tammy Mack show, they interviewed me Wednesday, June 15, 2022. They had me as a panelist. The topic was, should Juneteenth be a federal holiday? Yes, it should be a federal holiday. This is the only federal holiday that even recognizes that slavery existed in this country. But we have to correct the history of Juneteenth and protect the history of Juneteenth. This gives us an opportunity, with Juneteenth being a federal holiday, this gives us an opportunity to push into the national conversation in cable news, local news, radio, print, newspapers, magazines, things like this. This gives us an opportunity to push into the national conversation a history about this country that Republicans in state legislatures are passing laws to suppress the teaching of this history. Okay, so we have to use this as an opportunity to give America the massive history lesson that America desperately needs, but we have to correct the history of Juneteenth and protect the history of Juneteenth. It was not the last day of slavery. It was not the last day of slavery in this country. And it's not the last day of slavery in Texas, because you're going to have some slave owners that keep their African slaves for an additional year to 1866. And the Emancipation Proclamation did not free the slaves, as I've talked about in previous presentations, because it was a military strategy that Lincoln issued. And the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation was issued September 22nd, 1862. And it stated that the territories in rebellion, part of the Confederacy, the Confederate States of America, if they did not come back into the Union by January 1st, 1863, their slaves would be set free. And then it goes on to give exemptions for the border states like Maryland, Missouri, Kentucky, and Delaware. And those states that stayed loyal to the Union, the border states, they were allowed to keep their slaves. So Maryland does not abolish slavery until November 1st, 1864, which is almost 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation. So I was watching MSNBC today, and I'm hearing reporters on MSNBC saying, oh, in Galveston, Texas, they got the news that they were free because of the Emancipation Proclamation 2.5 years after it was issued. But nobody said that the African slaves in Maryland were free almost 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation was issued either. The Emancipation Proclamation did not free the slaves. This is why it's important to go to archives.gov, the U.S. National Archives website, or loc.gov, the Library of Congress website, and read all of these documents. Read the Emancipation Proclamation, read the U.S. Constitution, read the Declaration of Independence, read the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the 1965 Civil Rights Act. They have all that information there. Okay, so we know it's going to be the 13th Amendment, ratified December 6, 1865, when Georgia ratifies the 13th Amendment, that's legally going to end chattel slavery in this country, because it took a constitutional amendment to do this, because slavery was sanctioned by the U.S. Constitution. When you talk about Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3, which dealt with the 3/5 compromise, which did not say we were 3/5 of a human being, is dealing with counting 3/5 of the slave population in states that own slaves, especially the southern states, because a lot of the northern states had already abolished slavery by 1787. And it's dealing with, for the purpose of apportionment and taxation, for the purpose of determining how many seats in the House of Representatives slaveholding states would have. It's based upon population. So how do you count the slave population? Do you count the 100% of the population? Do you count the full population in states like Virginia and Alabama and things like this? Do you count the full population, Virginia, etc. You count the full population. Do you count the population? You count half of the population. Do you count 3/4 of the population? The South wanted to count the full population. The northern states are saying, wait a second, if you count 100% of the slave population in those southern states, then you're going to have the southern states will have total dominance in the House of Representatives, because the northern states had a larger population of free people, okay, but the southern states had a larger population in total when you counted in their African slaves. So that's what the Three-Fifths Compromise is. It's not saying we were 3/5 of a human being. And at the same time, the full population of free African Americans in 1787 and subsequently after that in 1790, when the first census was taken, etc. The full population of free African Americans was counted for the purpose of apportionment as well. Okay, so Article 4, Section 2 of the U.S. Constitution laid the foundation for the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 and 1850. So slavery was sanctioned by the U.S. Constitution. So it took a constitutional amendment to formally, legally end slavery in this country. All right, now, there was an article from, and how's everybody doing? Share this broadcasting in social media platforms. Give us a thumbs up, give us a heart, give us a like. I'm broadcasting from my smartphone. My laptop crashed on me. So I'm trying to get it repaired or replaced or what have you. Okay. Also visit our new website, theafricanhistorynetwork.com. Theafricanhistorynetwork.com is our new website. I built it before my laptop went down on me. So we have my DVD lectures. Like I have a 2.5-hour lecture dealing with the real history of Juneteenth. We go deep into this history. This presentation, Juneteenth history, Emancipation Day, but not Independence Day. We never got our 40 acres and a mule. Dr. King's Poor People's Campaign. We're coming to get our check. So this is at our website, theafricanhistorynetwork.com. It's a new website. We have it in DVD format. If you want in digital download format, email us, and we have in digital download format also. Okay, that's on sale, $10. And you can also register for the online history classes I teach on Saturdays and Sundays. Sundays, 2 p.m. to 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time is from the Civil War to the Civil Rights Movement and Black Power, 1865 to 1968. That's a 10-week online history course that I teach. We get deep into this history. And on Saturdays, I teach that one on Sundays. Saturdays, I teach ancient Kemet, the Moors, and the Ma'afa, understanding the transatlantic slave trade, what they didn't teach you in school. So we give you more information about those, but you can register for those classes and discount it at our website, theafricanhistorynetwork.com. All right, so there was a good article that I posted on our Facebook fan page, The African History Network, and my personal page, Michael M. Hotel. Posted this. This article came out June 19th, 2022, from the Washington Post. Not all enslaved Black people in Texas were freed on Juneteenth. Not all enslaved Black people in Texas were freed on Juneteenth. Apparently, people in mainstream media didn't read this article, because this is what I've been saying for years. And this article is written by Deneen L. Brown for the Washington Post. And I've read a number of articles by Deneen L. Brown, brilliant sister. She writes some really good articles. But what this article talks about is, despite the clear instructions in General Order Number 3 and the announcement that day in June 19th, 1865, and afterwards by Major General Gordon Granger's men, that the people of Texas are informed that in accordance with the proclamation from the executive of the United States, all slaves are free. All slaves are free. But despite this, not every enslaved African person in Texas was freed with that proclamation. And if we look at, I'm going to refer to my notes here on this. if we look at what General Order Number 3 stated, quote, the people of Texas are informed that in accordance with a proclamation from the executive of the United States, all slaves are free. This involves an absolute equality of personal rights. This involves an absolute equality of personal rights and property rights between former masters and slaves. And the connection heretofore existing between them becomes that between employer and hired labor. And the connection heretofore existing between them becomes that between an employer and hired labor. The freedmen are advised to remain quietly at their present homes and work for wages. Okay, so this is what General Order Number 3 says. Okay, now word of emancipation gradually spread over the vast state despite the efforts of some slaveholders to maintain slavery. Okay, despite the efforts of some slaveholders to maintain slavery, but some are going to maintain slavery because there were not enough Union troops to totally enforce it all throughout Texas. African Americans, however, would not be denied their liberty that had eluded them so long. When the news came, entire plantations were deserted. Many enslaved Africans brought from Arkansas, Louisiana, and Missouri during the Civil War returned home, while Texas freed persons headed for Galveston, Texas, Austin, Texas, Houston, Texas, and other cities where federal troops were stationed because there was more protection for them in those cities where federal troops were stationed. Okay, so now I want to go back to this article from the Washington Post. Not all freed enslaved Black people in Texas were freed on Juneteenth. Okay. Also, if you like this type of information, you want to support the African History Network, we have the information in the thread of the broadcast. You can support us, $ the AHN show through Cash App, $ the AHN show through Cash App, also PayPal, paypal.me/the AHN show. This helps us keep doing the research, stay on the air, keep broadcasting, do my Sunday night radio show, pay some of the bills, etc. We also have the information at our new website, theafricanhistorynetwork.com. It has information about Cash App. When you go to Cash App, it'll say Michael and show my picture there. Because there are about 5 or 6 fake African History Network Cash App accounts that are out there. They're using our logo, things like this. I've contacted Cash App. They've opened up an investigation about 6 weeks ago. They're slower than Heinz ketchup. So I'm trying to get these fake African History Network Cash App accounts shut down because they've been stealing money from us. Okay. So when you go to our Cash App account, $ the AHN show SHOW, and you'll see it scrolling at the bottom of the screen. When you go to it, it says Michael and shows my picture there. All right, now let's continue here. Okay, so enslavers across the state of Texas resisted the General Order Number 3, hiding the news from some enslaved Black people, some enslaved Africans. Many African people were forced to continue labor under the oppression of ruthless enslavers and unscrupulous plantation owners. So in some cases, the word is going to be kept away from them. In other cases, they're going to find out they were free, but they were forced by their slave owners to stay in captivity. Okay, because word is spreading from plantation to plantation. There was also another good article that I read. Now I have a whole file folder, so I'm not new to this at all. I have a whole file folder on Juneteenth. I've been doing presentations for going back to 2012. Then I got a file folder here dealing with articles dealing with Juneteenth. But there was a good one that came out June 20th, 2020. 4 enduring myths about Juneteenth are not based on facts. We're going to talk about this also because this dispels myths surrounding Juneteenth history. One of them I've already talked about, dealing with the Emancipation Proclamation. 4 enduring myths about Juneteenth are not based on facts. So we have to correct the history of Juneteenth, and we have to protect the history of Juneteenth. So everybody watching on Facebook and YouTube, give us a thumbs up, give us a heart, give us a like, share this broadcast on your social media platform, share it with your friends and family. Okay. So we know that June 17th, 2021, President Joe Biden signed into law the bill that passed the House of Representatives, passed the U.S. Senate. It was sponsored by Representative Sheila Jackson Lee of Texas in the House of Representatives. We know our sister, Mother Opal Lee, who was 94 years old last year. She's 95 now. We know she marched for years to make Juneteenth a national holiday, a federal holiday. We know she worked for years and marched to make Juneteenth a federal holiday. She's also a member of Zeta Phi Beta Sorority Incorporated, which are my sisters, because I'm a member of Phi Beta Sigma Fraternity Incorporated. So the announcement on June 19th, 1865, did not end slavery in Texas. The barbaric institution continued in other forms and by other names, according to historians. One historian, C.R. Gibbs, the initial C.R. and Gibbs, Gibbs, said there was almost universal agreement from statements of enslaved people that many Texas slave owners held off making the announcement. Many black Texans did not receive the news until 1866. Quote, slave owners resorted to tricks, they delayed, they postponed. This was money, C.R. Gibbs said. He's the author of the book Black, Copper, and Bright, B-R-I-G-H-T, Black, Copper, and Bright, the District of Columbia's Black Civil War Regiment. He said they wanted to continue to get every last drop of sweat from slavery. Now, even after Major General Gordon Granger's order, African people remained in, quote, such a delicate situation in Texas, C.R. Gibbs said, you have the collapse of the Confederate government and roving bands of men who wanted to turn the clock back. A Union officer said, quote, given a choice between hell and Texas, I would live in hell and rent out Texas. It was just that bad in Texas, he said. Now, during the Civil War, Texas was a refuge for enslavers, as I talked about before. And I spoke in Inkster, Michigan. I spoke at 2 locations in Inkster, Michigan on Saturday, St. Clement's Church, Saturday morning. And then also at the Floyd B. Simmons Recreational Center, they had a Juneteenth Middle Passage commemoration event there. So I spoke there, and it's important. See this one of the reasons why it's so important to celebrate Juneteenth. It celebrates freedom, number one, but this gives us an opportunity to deal with the history of the Civil War, 1861 to 1865, and the history of Reconstruction, which is the period of time after the Civil War, 1865 to 1877, and the advancements that African Americans were making when it came to acquiring land, getting education, starting businesses, getting elected to public office. There are about 2,000 African American men who got elected to elected office, public office during Reconstruction. And we're going to have a couple of U.S. senators like Hiram Rhodes Revels in 1870 out of Mississippi. You're going to have the majority of them are going to be in the House of Representatives. When we look at the state legislature of South Carolina, the majority of the state legislature of South Carolina were made up of African American men during Reconstruction. Then you're going to have the Compromise of 1877, which ends Reconstruction. We're going to see a reversal of these gains that we're making, but we're also going to see an increase in domestic terrorism. Even during Reconstruction, we see this. This is why 1871, the Ku Klux Klan Act, is implemented by President Ulysses S. Grant, October 1871. He declares martial law in 9 counties in South Carolina to crack down on activities of the Ku Klux Klan, who were attacking and killing African American elected officials, as well as white Republicans who were many of our allies. They were being attacked by the Klan and domestic terrorist organizations like the White League and the Red Shirts and things like this. Okay, so even after Major General Gordon, during the Civil War, Texas was a refuge for enslavers evading emancipation. Quote, slave owners in Arkansas, Tennessee, and Louisiana ran their Negroes from Arkansas, Louisiana, and other parts of the states into Texas because the U.S. Army had not reached Texas. Because the U.S. Army had not reached Texas, said W. Marvin Delaney, a retired University of Texas Arlington historian and president of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, also known as ASALH. ASALH is the organization that Dr. Carter G. Woodson co-founded September 9th, 1915 in Chicago. Okay, the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History, which is now the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. And we know in February 1926, Dr. Carter G. Woodson he founded Negro History Week. Okay, the second week in February, Negro History Week, which in 1976 became Black History Month. All right, even though in Virginia we know they were celebrating it for a whole month going back to about the 1940s and 1950s or so. All right, now after Major General Gordon Granger's order, General Order Number 3, the Union Army literally had to march across Texas to enforce the order and free enslaved African people. They literally had to march across Texas to enforce the order and free enslaved African people. Because keep in mind, they're on horseback, they're on foot, they're not in escalades. Okay, they're not in expeditions. They're on horseback and foot. Texas is a huge state. Okay, so they're going through for almost a year delivering General Order Number 3. This is why June 19th was the agreed upon date to commemorate and celebrate the General Order Number 3 being issued. But they're doing this for a number of days, not just one. In some cases, white enslavers killed enslaved African people rather than allow them their freedom. In some cases, now this is part of it. I haven't really, the only person I heard talk about this was Joy Ann Reid today on the readout. I haven't heard in all the coverage that I've seen this year in especially on cable news and reporters like here in local news here in Detroit. None of them have talked about this. There were approximately 2,500 enslaved African people who were killed by their slave masters in Texas to keep from setting them free. So when we deal with the history of Juneteenth, we come together for these celebrations. It has to be more than just a cookout. It has to be more than just dancing and singing, things like this. That's fine. We come together, but we have to have this historical component of it to protect the history of Juneteenth and correct the history of Juneteenth and educate our people on this history and educate America on this history as well, because Americans are very ignorant when it comes to history. Okay, so, and I want to also reference my binder here. This is one of the binders I use in the online history class I teach as well. From the Civil War to the Civil Rights Movement and Black Power, 1865 to 1968. There's actually two huge binders that I have full of information for that 10-week online class, because there's a piece here dealing with the role of white female slave owners in 1850 and 1860. And I want to talk about one named Martha Gibbs, who fled Mississippi and went into Texas with her African slaves. She's one of those people that did this. Okay, so Texans were so resentful that African Americans would become free that they literally carried out a pogrom, P-O-G-R-O-M. They literally carried out a pogrom, said W. Marvin Delaney, citing a speech by Barry A. Crunch, a professor of history at Gallaudet University, Gallaudet. Quote, they killed as many as 2,500. They were just murdered outright across the state of Texas. Now, violence increased against African Americans between 1865 and 1868. And we know we have the Opelousas massacre of 1868, Opelousas, Louisiana, and that was surrounding politics and African Americans voting, the Opelousas massacre. In some cases, enslaved African people in Texas were run down by bloodhounds or shot rather than being released from bondage. Quote, it takes almost over a year for the Union Army to literally go across the state of Texas and free African Americans from slavery. So the article goes on to talk about how, what I've stated numerous times before, the Emancipation Proclamation did not free the slaves. Slavery formally ended in the United States December 6, 1865, with the ratification of the 13th Amendment, which stated, quote, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall never be duly convicted, shall exist within the United States. Now, people talk about a loophole that re-enslaves African Americans. I encourage you, that's a myth. The 13th Amendment is based upon what's known as the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. That phrase dealing with involuntary servitude, things like this, that already existed and already applied to white men. And they're given the same rights to African American men. And if you look at prison rates and things like this, even leading up to the 1970s, the prison rates in this country were relatively low. Yes, African Americans disproportionately made up prisoners, but what people call mass incarceration, that doesn't really start till about 1970, 1971, because Richard Nixon declares his war on drugs June 17, 1971, in front of Congress. And from 1970 to 1993, the U.S. prison population quadruples in this country, goes from about 300,000 in 1970 to 1.3 million in 1993. You can go to BJS.gov, Bureau of Justice Statistics website, U.S. government, BJS.gov. You can look at the incarceration numbers for decades. Now, this is before the 1994 crime bill. That wasn't signed until September 13, 1994. I know people like to think that, oh, that's 94 crime bill created mass incarceration. No, it didn't. You didn't look at the period of time from 1970 to 1993. U.S. prison population quadrupled during that period of time. That's before the crime bill was even signed into law. Okay, so watch I interviewed Dr. Darrell Scott, history professor at Howard University. He's a historian, former past president of ASALH, Association for the Study of African American Life and History. And he's a friend of mine. I interviewed him for about 2 hours. We went through and dealt with, it's on our YouTube channel, Michael Imhotep, IMHOTEP. It's on my Facebook fan page, The African History Network as well. It's archived there. And you can just Google his name and my name. His name, D-A-R-Y-L, one R in his name, Darrell. You can Google his name and my name, and the video probably come up. And he went through step by step and dealt with how there's a whole misunderstanding of the 13th Amendment, people thinking that it re-enslaved people, things like this. Now, there's an effort now by well-meaning people to, they say, abolish slavery and get rid of the 13th Amendment, abolish the 13th Amendment state by state, things like this. Okay, that's if you want to do that, that's fine. But the question I would ask people, if your argument is the 13th Amendment is still enslaving people in this country, Then from my understanding, there are 4 states that have abolished the 13th Amendment. The question I would ask is, the day before the 13th Amendment was abolished in those 4 states, how many people were enslaved because of the 13th Amendment? And the day after it was abolished, how many people were freed because the 13th Amendment was abolished in those states? If you want to remove language, that's fine. But if you're saying people in those states where the law exists are enslaved because of that law, because of the 13th Amendment and what you call a loophole, then my question would be, in those 4 states where it has been removed, it has been abolished, how many people were enslaved the day before the law was abolished because of the 13th Amendment? Because you said that slavery still existed. So how many people were enslaved because of that? And the day after it was repealed, or the week after, or the month after, how many people were free because that law was abolished? So you want to remove language, that's fine. But what evidence are you citing that people were enslaved because of that language? And what states have abolished privatized prisons because the 13th Amendment was repealed in those states? Now, I know California abolished privatized prisons because it was passed in the state legislature, signed into law by Governor Gavin Newsom, things like this, right? But I don't think that was because the 13th Amendment was repealed in California. Okay, so all right. Watch the interview that I did with Dr. Darrell Scott. It's an excellent history lesson. Now, but people want to remove language. Okay, all right. So let me see here. All right. Now, another thing that's extremely important to understand, and I've heard a little bit about this previously in all my research on Juneteenth, but probably nothing in mainstream media about this. You had slave owners in Texas after General Order Number 3 is issued. They're going to flee Texas and take their African slaves, and they go to Cuba and Brazil as a safe haven, because Cuba did not abolish slavery until 1886, and Brazil did not abolish slavery until 1888. And there are descendants of these white supremacist Confederates. They're descendants that still live in Brazil today. They're called Confederados. How many people knew about this? They're called Confederados, okay? Now, some enslavers resisted. We go back to the article from the Washington Post. Not all enslaved Black people in Texas were freed on Juneteenth. Here's the article, and I have my notes here written on it as well. You got to bear with me. My laptop crashed on me, and it went down and won't start up, so I have to, like I said, send it to the insurance company, try to see what they're going to do, and try to get, I don't know how long that whole process is going to take. I never had to do it before. So I'm going to see if I can try to get a laptop in the meantime, because I'm crippled without it. But if we continue here, page 3 of this article, or page 4, some enslavers resisted the Emancipation Proclamation Order and resisted General Order Number 3 by fleeing, F-L-E-E-I-N-G, fleeing, taking their enslaved African workers south to Cuba and Brazil, where slavery had not been outlawed. Cuba outlawed slavery in 1886. Brazil outlawed slavery in 1888. And we know that the majority of the Africans who were part of the Middle Passage, who were taken out of Africa, the majority of them did not come to the United States. we know the largest population go to South America, especially Brazil. And then they're going to go to the Caribbean. They go to Haiti and Jamaica and Puerto Rico and Honduras, Hispaniola. And we know the western third of Hispaniola is where you have Haiti, Saint Dominique, what the French called it, Santo Domingo is what the Spanish called it. So the somewhere maybe 4 or 5% actually come to the U.S. Okay. So this is a part of the history dealing with Juneteenth that almost nobody talks about. These white supremacists that flee, these slave owners that flee Texas to avoid freeing their slaves, and they go to Cuba and Brazil to keep them enslaved. Now, the kidnapping of African people out of the country struck fear in those who were still in precarious situations in the control of their former enslavers without protection from Union troops. Frederick Douglass's brother, Perry Downs, Perrydowns, Perry Downs, who was enslaved in Texas, recounted hearing his enslaver say that he would run his quote unquote property out of Texas. He would run his quote unquote property out of Texas. Now, no one knows how many enslaved African people were driven farther south by enslavers, because we know Cuba is 90 miles away from the United States. Okay, Cuba. Okay, and that was Spanish territory, and then Cuba's going to gain its independence. You have the Spanish-American War, 1898. If you saw the movie Posse with Melvin Van Peebles and Mario Van Peebles and Sally Richardson, that movie Posse takes place in 1889. It takes place in 1898. During, you know, they were deserters from the Army, from the U.S. Army. That takes place in 1898 during the Spanish-American War. That's the backdrop. That's the setting, historical setting of that whole movie. That's a fantastic movie. Posse. Big Daddy Kane is in there. That's a fantastic movie, and they have some deep history in there. One of the things they talk about is approximately 1/3 of what we call cowboys during the Old West were black, African American. Okay, and the term cowboy originally was a derogatory term because white men were called cattlemen, or cowhands. African American men were called cowboys. Okay, but our skills when it came to roping steer and bullfights and all that stuff. Okay, the rodeos and Bill Pickett rodeos, things like that. Our skill set was so good that it caused us to have a lot of, it caused even white men to respect a lot of us, one, because of our skills. But cowboy became a general term and lost its negative stereotypical stigma. Okay, but originally cowboy was a pejorative, derisive term used for African American men, calling them a boy. Okay, so let's continue here. No one knows how many enslaved African people were driven farther south by enslavers to avoid freeing them out of Texas and going. Some are going to go into Cuba. Others are going to take their African slaves to Brazil. Quote, there were unnamed numbers of black people taken out of the United States to places where there was still slavery, end quote. Said, this was C.R. Gibbs, the historian C.R. Gibbs. Now, slavery was not abolished in Cuba until 1886, as I said previously. Brazil became the last country in the Americas to abolish slavery in 1888. So they're looking, so just as many of these slave owners like Martha Gibbs, who we're going to talk about here in just a minute, and Professor Stephanie E. Jones Rogers talks about Martha Gibbs in her book, They Were Her Property, which deals with white women and slavery. Okay, They Were Her Property. white women as slave owners in the American South. This is a book that came out February 2019. I did a presentation about Professor Stephanie E. Jones Rogers' work in her book when this came out in 2019. Martha Gibbs was a white female slave owner from Mississippi, and she leaves Mississippi and takes her African slaves into Texas, okay? Because Texas was a safe haven for many slave owners because there was less of a presence of Union troops in Texas, and Texas was more removed from battles during the Civil War also. All right, so slavery was not abolished in Cuba until 1886. And it was not abolished in Brazil until 1888. To this day, descendants of Confederates who drove enslaved African people into Brazil celebrate with festivals. They celebrate with festivals to this day in Brazil. These descendants of these white supremacist Confederates celebrate to this day with festivals in Brazil in the cities of Americana and Santa Barbara de Oeste, D''Oeste, celebrating the Confederate States of America with Confederate flag displays and dances. So these were two cities in Brazil that these Confederates fleeing the U.S. with their African slaves, they founded these two cities. Their descendants of these white slave owners still live, some of them still live in those two cities today, okay? There's another article I'm going to reference dealing with this, because this article here from the Washington Post references another article from the Washington Post on July 11th, 2020 that goes deeper into this history. This is a piece of history related to Juneteenth that is not talked about, okay? One, approximately up to 2,500 enslaved Africans being killed by their slave owners here in Texas, here in the U.S., in Texas, to keep from freeing them. That's not talked about. And then those slave owners that flee Texas with their African slaves into Cuba and Brazil is not dealt with as well. Now, in the United States, as communities prepare for Juneteenth celebrations, historians say revelers should also pause in somber acknowledgement that the hardship of involuntary labor and racial terror against African people continued long after Major General Gordon Granger stood on the courthouse steps in Galveston, or at the Ashton Villa in Galveston, Texas, which is a mansion on Broadway Street in Galveston, Texas. Okay, and going throughout issuing special field order number general order number 3. Special field order number 15 is what's known as 40 acres in the mule. Quote, Juneteenth should be celebrated to recognize the symbolic emancipation of African Americans from slavery in Texas, said the historian W. Marvin Delaney, a retired University of Texas Arlington historian and president of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. He said, let's celebrate it, but also realize it took much longer and much more than an order from a Union Army general to end slavery in this country. It took much longer and much more than an order from a Union Army general to end slavery in this country. Once again, as I said before, and as I've been saying for years, Juneteenth did not free, all African slaves in Texas were not freed June 19th, 1865, or even after that, as they're going through issuing and delivering General Order number 3. Some are going to be kept enslaved until the following year, 1866, and then some are going to be forced to go with their slave masters into Cuba and Brazil. So yes, we should celebrate Juneteenth. This is time for us to come together, celebrate who we are, celebrate our history, honor our ancestors, engage in economic empowerment, and support African American owned businesses. We have to have a political education component, not just talking about voting. What are you voting for? We have to have a political education component infused into these Juneteenth celebrations. Because when I do my presentations, I deal with history, political education, law, and economic empowerment. Okay? Politics is the legal distribution of scarce wealth, power, and resources, and the writing of laws, statutes, ordinances, amendments, and treaties, their adoption, interpretation, and enforcement. Politics, it impacts every aspect of our lives. Okay? So all these things, in these issues and laws and things like this, policies that we advocate for, they're all shaped by politics. So voting is one part of politics, but who you vote for and the policies you advocate for largely has to do with your understanding of history and law. Okay, so how's everybody doing? Give us a thumbs up, give us a heart, give us a like. How y'all like this type of information? If you want to learn more about this type of history, be sure to visit our new website, theafricanhistorynetwork.com. You have to bear with me, my allergies still bother me. I'm allergic to pollen. They're much better than they were like 3 weeks ago, but you just have to bear with me. Visit our new website, theafricanhistorynetwork.com, THE, theafricanhistorynetwork.com. You can order my DVD lectures there, and we have digital downloads also. This one deals with the real history of Juneteenth. This is about a 2.5-hour lecture. Juneteenth history, Emancipation Day, but not Independence Day. We never got our 40 acres and a mule. Dr. King's Poor People's Campaign will come to get our check. It's a 2.5-hour lecture. I got this one here, Black Wall Street, from the Destruction to the Resurrection of Economic Empowerment. This is a 2.5-hour lecture dealing with the real history of Black Wall Street, the origins of Tulsa, Oklahoma. Tulsa, Oklahoma was founded around 1834 by Creek Indians who get pushed off their land in southeastern United States because of the Indian Removal Act of 1830, signed into law by President Andrew Jackson. And the Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, Cherokee, and Seminole Indians all go on what's known as the Trail of Tears, over 1,000 miles into Oklahoma. When they go into Oklahoma, they take their African slaves with them, because what's known as the 5 civilized tribes of Native Americans, they all owned African slaves. So Tulsa was founded by Creek Indians. The word Tulsa comes from the Creek Indian word Tallahassee. And this is a lot of the early African American landowners in Tulsa, Oklahoma. A lot of them got land from what's known as the Black Freedmen Indian Treaties of 1866 and the Dawes Allotment Act of 1887, which redistributed land to Native Americans and Black Indians. Now, white people get 2/3 of this land. This is where you get the $5 Indian from, because when white people found out that this land redistribution was taking place, it's about 138 million acres of land that was being redistributed. You had to anglicize your name. You had to anglicize your name to be put onto the Dawes rolls. So it's like a type of census, so to speak. So white people were paying $5 to get their names added to the Dawes rolls and getting land also. This lecture here, when black men dominated horse racing and how an organized effort forced them out. Okay, this deals with how we used to win the Kentucky Derby, dominate horse racing. The first Kentucky Derby was ran in 1875. It was won by this brother right here, Oliver Lewis. He was 19 years old and a former slave. He won the first Kentucky Derby. 13 of the 15 jockeys in the first Kentucky Derby were African American jockeys, many of them former slaves. Lewis's trainer, his name was Ansel Williams. Okay, Ansel Williams was an older African American man. He was a former slave as well. So this deals with how we used to dominate horse racing and how we got pushed out of horse racing by jealous white men. This one right here, 6 principles of political self-defense. 6 principles of political self-defense. Understanding how public policies and laws affect the economic conditions of African Americans. This ties all that together: politics, economic empowerment, understanding laws and policies, etc. Okay, now there was so that's all at our new website, theafricanhistorynetwork.com. You can also register for the 10-week online history classes that I teach there as well. It's right on the homepage. Okay, so there was a good article from there was a good article from history.com which deals with the massive overlooked role of female slave owners, the massive overlooked role of female slave owners. This is from March 12, 2019. And it talks about it references the book by Professor Stephanie E. Jones Rogers, They Were Her Property, and it deals with her research. She's a African American woman, brilliant sister. She's a history professor at the University of California, Berkeley, and her book deals with citing Census Bureau statistics and other evidence. In 1850 and 1860 in this country, 40% of slave owners were white women. Okay. The name of her book, They Were Her Property, White Women as Slave Owners in the American South, came out in February 2019. Slaveholding, and the article says the high number of people, and they talk about Martha Washington, George Washington's wife, because Martha Washington owned more slaves than George Washington did when they got married. Stephanie E. Jones Rogers, a history professor at the University of California, Berkeley, is compiling data on just how many white women owned slaves in the U.S. and in the parts of the 1850 and 1860 U.S. Census, the 1850 and 1860 U.S. Census data she studied so far. White women make up 40% of all slave owners in 1850 and 1860. Slaveholding parents typically gave their daughters more enslaved people than land. Slave owning parents typically gave their daughters more enslaved African people than they gave them land. Quote, what this means is that their very identities as white women are tied to the actual or the possible ownership of other people, end quote, said Professor Stephanie E. Jones Rogers. Now, the article goes on to say white women were active and violent participants in the slave market. They bought, sold, managed, and sought the return of enslaved African people in whom they had a vested economic interest. Owning a large number of enslaved African people made a woman, a white woman, a better marriage prospect, Once married, white women fought in courts to preserve their legal ownership over enslaved African people and often won in court. Quote, for them, slavery was their freedom. For them, slavery was their freedom, said Professor Stephanie E. Jones Rogers. Now, in this article, they talk about Martha Gibbs, page 3. White women also fought to maintain the wealth and free labor that slavery provided them through the Civil War. Civil War is 1861 to 1865. Okay. The U.S., as Union troops made their way through the South, freeing enslaved African people, white women would move enslaved people farther from the soldiers' path. One white woman named Martha Gibbs, not Marla Gibbs, 227 and the Jeffersons. There's no place like home. I mean, no place child. Not Marla Gibbs, Martha Gibbs. Okay. One white woman named Martha Gibbs even took enslaved African people to Texas and forced them to work for her at gunpoint until 1866. This gets back to what I was talking about, saying all enslaved African people in Texas were not freed in 1865. Okay? The slaves that Martha Gibbs owned is an example of that. She kept her African slaves by force until 1866. And this is even after the 13th Amendment ratified December 6, 1865, when Georgia ratifies the 13th Amendment. Now, after the Civil War, Southern white women sought to recreate slavery through exploitative work contracts. Some also wrote books portraying the institution of slavery as gentle and benign. The most famous being Gone with the Wind by Margaret Mitchell, which is one of the biggest pieces of propaganda when it comes to the history of slavery. Gone with the Wind and Mammy and Butterfly McQueen, Hattie McDaniels, Mammy and Butterfly McQueen. I don't know nothing about birthing no babies, things like this. One of the biggest pieces of propaganda. Rhett Butler, Clark Gable, frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn. Scarlett O'Hara, all this just nonsense. Some also wrote books portraying the institution of slavery as gentle and benign. The most famous being Gone with the Wind by Margaret Mitchell, a woman born 35 years after abolition, after slavery ends 1865. Yet, as Professor Stephanie E. Jones Rogers argues in her book, They Were Her Property, it was not only white women, quote, ideological and sentimental connections, end quote, to slavery that made white women defend it. Scarlett O'Hara would have been protecting her economic interests too. Scarlett O'Hara would have been protecting her economic interests too. So check out this second article. Now this is one of the articles that we reference, because this is in the class I teach on Sundays, 2 p.m. to 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, from the Civil War to the Civil Rights Movement and Black Power, 1865 to 1968. Usually I show you the information on my website, but my laptop is down and I can't show it to you. But if you visit our new website, theafricanhistorynetwork.com, we have it in the thread of the broadcast, theafricanhistorynetwork.com. You can register for my 10-week online classes. They're on sale right now, limited time only, regularly $130. They're on sale $60. After you register, you have full access even after the class is over with. So a year from now, 2 years from now, you can go watch the entire course. You can use this information with your family, with your children. Also, we have a bundle pack. You can register for both classes for $100. Okay. So the name of this article here, The Massive Overlooked Role of Female Slave Owners. This is from history.com, which is the official website of the History Channel. And this is from March 12, 2019. The class I teach on Saturdays, 2 p.m. to 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, is from the Civil War to the Civil Rights Movement and Black Power, 1865 to 1968. From the Civil War, the one I teach on Saturday, Ancient Kemet, the Moors, and the Ma'afa, Understanding the Transatlantic Slave Trade, what they didn't teach you in school, okay? And we deal with thousands of years of history and what leads up to the transatlantic slave trade taking place. So we have a bundle pack. You can register for both classes right now. We have a bundle pack for $100, and there's additional content that you get. You get free lectures from me in digital format. So it's about a $360 value that you get. It's about excuse me, about a $360 value that you get for $100. Okay. And like I said, even after the 10-week online classes are over with, you can go back and watch it anytime. Okay. And you go back and watch it anytime. You still have full access. A year from now, 2 years from now, you'll still have full access to the class. All right. Let's continue. Okay. There's this other article that I want to get to. This gets deeper into the history of white slave owners in Texas, fleeing Texas and forcing their African slaves to go to Cuba and Brazil so that they can continue to enslave them after 1865. 99.9% of the conversations dealing with Juneteenth don't deal with this. Don't deal with this history. Okay. So the article from the Washington Post, the first article from Washington Post that I shared with you, that was this one here. Not all enslaved Black people in Texas were freed on Juneteenth. Okay, that came out June 19th, 2022. And another reason why this is so important, there's a lot of misinformation that's floating around in the media dealing with the history of Juneteenth, last day of slavery, things like this. Because it's a federal holiday, it gives us an opportunity to have this conversation about history and correct the misinformation. If it wasn't a federal holiday, you wouldn't see all these articles being written about it. And look at the articles here on the African History Network on Facebook, and I post a lot of those articles. You wouldn't have this coverage in media. So we have to use this to, one, educate ourselves, two, educate America and give America the massive history lesson that it needs. But that history has to be corrected. The history has to be corrected at whitehouse.gov. The history has to be corrected in the history books. And then we have to use that as a springboard to force the policies that we want and vote people in the office who will vote for those policies. Because it takes 218 votes to get any bill passed in the House of Representatives. So many of these bills will pass the House of Representatives, but you don't have 60 votes in the Senate for it. Okay, George Floyd Justice and Policing Act passed the U.S. House of Representatives by a vote of 220 to 212. No Republicans voted for the bill. Remember that come November 2022. No Republicans voted for the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, even though they talked about how, oh, it was so terrible what happened to George Floyd. But when it came time to do something about it, you voted against it. Then when it goes to the Senate, it was blocked by Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina, who said the sticking point was defund the police, which is a lie, because September 25th, 2021, the Fraternal Order of Police and the International Association of Police Chiefs put out a joint statement saying that defund the police was never part of the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, number one. Number two, that those two organizations supported the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. And they talked about how it would protect the rights of police. It would make communities safer. It gave additional funding for police, because contrary to popular belief, and even Senator Cory Booker of New Jersey said this. There's an article from CNN that talks about this because he did an interview with CNN. The George Floyd Justice and Policing Act actually funds the police. I've dealt with this on my show, the African History Network show. The George Floyd Justice and Policing Act actually funds the police. It does not defund the police. It funds the police. Senator Cory Booker said the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act spends millions more on policing, M-O-R-E, more, in addition to. Okay, he said it spends millions more on policing. And let me see here. Hold on, we'll get so like this is so those maybe is your first time watching this type of research I do. See, these are all articles here. I got 2 stacks of articles. Let me just show you. Let me just these people think I'm playing. See, I don't play games. I got 2 stacks to my right. This is 1 stack of all articles. This ain't duplicate stuff. Okay, this is 1 stack of articles. This is the other stack of articles here. This is the type of research that I do. This is another stack of articles. See, this deals with the California Reparations Task Force. This is another stack of articles right here. This is one of the 2 binders that I teach from for my Sunday class. This is one of the binders. From the Civil War to the Civil Rights Movement and Black Power, 1865-1968. These are file folders of articles. This is one dealing with Juneteenth. I'm a historian. I don't play games. Proper documentation ends all conversation. This is my file folder on reparations. These are all articles dealing with reparations. This is my file folder on critical race theory. Articles dealing with critical race theory, what it is. This just deals with a bunch of current articles here. This is this one right here. This was actually a lot of stuff in here dealing with Buffalo, New York, and the Justice Department and their response to shooting Buffalo, New York. This is I have crates. I have a couple crates on the other side of the office full of file folders with articles. So I don't play games. All right. Now, this one, this article here, this gets deeper into the slave owners fleeing Texas going into Cuba and Brazil. They lost the Civil War and fled to Brazil. They lost the Civil War and fled to Brazil. Their descendants refused to take down the Confederate flag. This is from July 11, 2020. Who has talked about this? Who have you heard talk about this, talking about Juneteenth? Because most of what I hear, a lot of the history I hear about Juneteenth is wrong. Okay, it was not the last day of slavery. Emancipation Proclamation did not free the slaves. All the slaves weren't freed on Juneteenth in Texas. Just wrong. To Marina Lee Colbachini, Colbachini, to Marina Lee Colbachini. Her middle name is Lee. Pay attention to that. It was a family tradition. Each spring, she would join the throngs who descended on a nondescript city in Brazil, don a 19th century hoop skirt, and square dance to country music. Now, she's in Brazil. It's like, why are they square dancing? The theme of the annual festival was the Confederate States of America. This is in Brazil. How many people have heard of this? The theme of the annual festival was the Confederate States of America, the Confederacy. It's one of history's lesser known episodes. After the Civil War, thousands of defeated Southerners came to Brazil to self-exile in a country that still practiced slavery. After the Civil War, thousands of defeated Southerners came to Brazil to self-exile in a country that still practiced slavery. For decades, FOR, for decades, their descendants have thrown a massive party that now attracts thousands of people to the twin cities of Americana and Santa Barbara de Oeste, O-E-D apostrophe O-E-S-T, de Oeste, to celebrate all things Dixie, D-I-X-I-E. The Confederate flag is everywhere, or what we call the Confederate flag, which is really the Confederate battle flag of Northern Virginia under General Robert E. Lee's army. Okay, the flag that's on top of the Dukes of Hazzard car, in the car on the Dukes of Hazzard, the General Lee is named after General Robert E. Lee, who's a white supremacist slave owner who took up arms against the Union to maintain slavery. He was from Virginia, General Robert E. Lee. That was the battle flag of his army. He had the largest Confederate army, okay? And when he surrenders to General Ulysses S. Grant, April 9th, 1865, this, many people say that's the end of the Civil War. So it's really going to ramp down and start coming to a close, really coming to a close. But keep in mind, the Civil War is going to continue for another 16 months. The reason why is because even though General Robert E. Lee's army was the largest Confederate army, it was not the only Confederate army. There were smaller armies like General Joseph E. Johnston's Confederate army in Texas. He had 90,000 troops, okay? Nathan Bedford Forrest a Confederate army as well. So terms of surrender had to be negotiated with each one of those smaller Confederate armies. So it's going to be August of 1866 that President Andrew Johnson uh, announces a formal end to the Civil War. So it's going to go on actually for another 16 months, but to a much lesser extent. Okay, now on flagpoles and knickknacks emblazoned on the dance floor, clutched by men clad in Confederate battle gray, decorating the grounds of the cemetery that holds the remains of veterans of the rebel army, the traitors, the Confederate army. They have a cemetery there in those two cities where they're buried. The immigrants known here in Brazil as Confederados, Confederados, Confederados. And the Confederates set up two cities in Brazil, Americana and Santa Barbara de Oeste, in a country that has long been more preoccupied with class division than racism. The Confederate symbols, stripped of their American context, never registered much notice. But now, as the racial reckoning in the United States following the killing of George Floyd, May 25th, 2020, in Minneapolis, Minnesota, inspires a similar re-examination of values in Brazil, that has begun to change. Okay, so keep in mind this article is from July 11th, 2020. Okay, so basically 2 months after George Floyd was killed. Now, Brazilians in recent weeks in July 2020 have demanded the removal of the notorious statue in Sao Paulo of a 17th century settler who enslaved indigenous people. Protests for Black equality have rumbled through several cities, and in the two cities founded by Confederates, Americana and Santa Barbara, the cities founded by the Confederates, Brazilians who have never been to the United States are increasingly asking questions piercingly familiar to Americans. Brazilians who have never been to the United States are increasingly asking questions piercingly familiar to Americans. Where should the Confederacy be remembered? Should it be remembered on a flagpole or in a museum? Now, Marina Lee Colbachini, who is she's a descendant of one of these Confederates. She said, quote, "My mind has been opened to the questions." She's 35 years old. Her middle name, Lee, pays homage to the traitor General Robert E. Lee, Confederate General Robert E. Lee. She attended the festival for most of her life, but now has stopped going. Despite worrying what her community might think, she has begun asking that Confederate battle flag be taken down. She said, quote, "It represents my family's tradition," she said. "It represents my family's traditions. But in the entire world, in the United States, they know what it also represents." End quote. Now, the debate has simmered for years. One side is the Fraternity of American Descendants, the group that throws the annual party there in Brazil, tends to the Confederate cemetery grounds and promotes a lost cause orthodoxy reminiscent of the most ardent Confederate apologists. Now, the lost cause is something like about 125, 150 year effort to rewrite the history of the Civil War, revisionist history, and make the South seem like they're the victims, and they're the ones keeping Africans enslaved, and is to say that the Civil War, the South was fighting for states' rights. It wasn't about slavery, it was states' rights. No, you wanted states' rights to keep Africans enslaved. That's what it was. Because in your statements of secession, you talked about how slavery was central to your way of life and central to your wealth that you've accumulated, things like this. So you wanted states' rights to maintain slaves. Now, on the other hand, in the Black Union for Equality, which has been leading a community charge to strip the festival in Brazil of the Confederate battle flag, considered by many to be a symbol of hate and repression. Okay. It's an organization called the Black Union for Equality. Now, in what might be the farthest outpost of the American culture wars, a new battle over the Confederate battle flag is only just beginning. But it's beginning. It's taking place in Brazil, okay, where these two cities exist that were founded by white slave owners fleeing, especially Texas, in 1865, going into Brazil to keep their Africans enslaved, because Brazil did not abolish slavery till 1888. Some are going to go into Cuba because Cuba did not abolish slavery until 1886. Okay, so the article goes on to say they have a section called A Mass Exodus in Search of Land and Slaves. A mass exodus in search of land and slaves. Okay. In this article here from the Washington Post. The newspapers called it Brazilian fever. Okay. Have you all heard this type of history before dealing with Juneteenth? Who's sharing this with you? Remember when you heard this first. The newspapers called it Brazilian fever. With the war lost, the Civil War, thousands of Southerners, fearful of living under Northern rule among freed slaves, were seeking other opportunities. Some pushed for Mexico, others pushed for Venezuela. But Brazil, which would not abolish slavery for another 23 years, because they abolished slavery in 1888. But Brazil proved to be the most attractive of these countries. Emperor Dom Pedro II, a fierce advocate of the South during the war, tried to induce their immigration, offering free transport, cheap land, and an easy path to citizenship. Before long, Southerners from the United States sailed out from New Orleans and Mobile, Alabama for Rio de Janeiro. Eventually, between 8,000 and 20,000 emigrated. Between 8,000 and 20,000 Southern whites flee the U.S., flee the South, because they don't want to be under Union rule, and they're fearing these freed African slaves. Maybe they're fearing retribution. I don't know. You know, chickens coming home to roost. So between 8,000 and 20,000 flee and go into Brazil. Have you ever heard this before? Now, Colonel Charles Gunter, Gunter, urged in a letter to the Charleston Mercury newspaper in 1868. He said, quote, "Move here and buy land. Move here and buy land. We have here a beautiful place for our village in the center of rich land and on a grand river. We have here a beautiful place for our village, the center of rich land, and on a grand river," end quote. But historians say one of the central draws was a country where Southerners could freeze time and continue a lifestyle that have been put to a violent end in the United States. They wanted to stay dominant and keep their slaves. En Vogue said, give it up, turn it loose. They didn't want to give it up, turn it loose. Okay, they had a good thing going. They said, we're going to leave the country to keep these Africans enslaved. Because, you know, one would ask the question. So, you know, one of the stereotypes is that, you know, African people were lazy and the slaves were lazy and things like this, right? So let me get this straight. You're going to leave the country and sail to Brazil to keep lazy Africans enslaved, and you got to take care of them? No, they weren't enslaved. And we had skills also. See, the other thing was there were at least 262 skills, trades, and crafts that African people had in this country from 1619 to 1865. We were the shipbuilders, the basket makers, the barrel makers. Actually, so I teach this in my classes. So be sure, if you like this type of information, be sure to visit our new website, theafricanhistorynetwork.com. It's much easier to navigate on your smartphone. You can order the DVD lectures right from the smartphone, register for the online classes I teach right from the smartphone. So this helps us keep doing the research, stay on the air, pay the bills, etc. There are at least 262 skills, trades, and crafts that African people had in this country from 1619 to 1865. Okay, at least 262 skills, trades, and crafts. And these skills are going to help build America. A lot of these skills we brought with us from Africa. So we were the anchor makers, the artists, we were barrel makers, bartenders, barbers, ship makers, engineers, all different types of things like this. This information comes from the book by James Newton and Ronald Lewis. Okay, the name of the book is called The Other Slaves, Mechanics, Artisans, and Craftsmen. It's from 1978. Okay, The Other Slaves, Mechanics, Artisans, and Craftsmen. At the Charles H. Wright Museum of African American History here in Detroit, they have a display when you go through their main exhibit called And Still We Rise. They have a display when you go through and come out on the other side. They have a display that lists all these skills, trades, and crafts that we had in this country from 1619 to 1865. Okay, so what happened was I was there June 7th, 2013, I think it was, or 2012. I was there, and no, I'm sorry. It's July 13th, 2012. I was there, July 13th, 2012. And I was looking at the exhibit, and they had a sign there that said you could not take pictures. Okay. So I went home and got a pen and a pad, and I spent an hour writing down all the skills, trades, and crafts that we had in this country from 1619 to 1865. And then I numbered them. Okay, that's how I know it's 262. Here's a photocopy of what I wrote down. All right, this is just the first page. There's 66 on the first page, skills, trades, and crafts that we had in this country from 1619 to 1865. We didn't just pick cotton and cook food for the master. Okay, this is page 4. And you see 262. That's how I know there was at least 262, because I wrote them all down and numbered them. All right, now, also, if you like this type of information, you can support the African History Network, $, the AHN show through Cash App, $, the AHN show through Cash App, also through PayPal, paypal.me, paypal.me. That helps us keep doing the research, stay on the air, keep broadcasting, pay some of the bills, etc. Okay, and share this broadcast on your social media platforms. Give us a thumbs up, give us a heart, give us a like if you like this type of information. And we also have the information there in the thread of the broadcast. And visit our new website, theafricanhistorynetwork.com. All right, now let's continue here. But historians say one of the central draws for these Southern whites, was a country where Southerners could freeze time and continue a lifestyle that they had that had been put to a violent end in the United States. In journals, one bragged about how inexpensive Brazilian slaves were. In journals, people would brag about how inexpensive Brazilian slaves were. Another lamented that they could not bring recently freed American slaves to Brazil. Quote, they came to continue having slaves. Luciana Brito, Brito, a historian at the Federal University of Reconcavo de Bahia, Bahia. She said they associated the existence of slavery in Brazil with the maintenance of a system of racial subservience. They associated the existence of slavery in Brazil with the maintenance of a system of racial subservience, end quote. Now Luciana Brito and other historians have scoured letters, journal entries, and deeds of sale. One researcher found that more than 3/4 of Southerners, white Southerners from the U.S. South, who wrote to the Brazilian government to inquire about immigration were slaveholders. More than 3/4 of white Southerners who wrote to the Brazilian government to inquire about immigration were slaveholders. At least 54 families bought at least 536 African slaves in Brazil upon entering Brazil. At least 54 families bought at least 536 slaves upon entering Brazil. Using racial epithets, they expressed fears of an African government in Brazil. Okay, some people are just never satisfied. You're going to flee the U.S. because you're afraid of Union control and you're afraid of freed African slaves because now the shoe's on the other foot and you're afraid of the chickens coming home to roost. So now you're going to flee to Brazil and you fear an African government in Brazil. Why don't you just go back to England or Germany or wherever your ancestors came from? I'm just wondering. You're going to go to Brazil where the largest number of Africans were taken into from Africa. That's where you're going to go, Brazil. Why don't you go to England? Using racial epithets, they expressed fears of a quote-unquote African government in Brazil and Black rulers in the United States. Quote, the Confederados, and once again, the Confederados, this is what those Confederates who set up 2 cities in Brazil were called. They set up the city of Americana and Santa Barbara de Oeste, D''Oeste. Quote, the Confederados presented themselves as refugees of a devastated America. Oh, now you're the victim. You enslaving African people, holding them against their will so you can profit off them. Now you're the victim. Said Jordan Brasher, a geographer at Columbia State University who wrote his dissertation on the Confederado communities in Brazil. Quote, as the downtrodden, poor, defeated Confederate soldiers looking to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, they also brought the ideology of white supremacy and racial terrorism from the United States to Brazil. And see, white supremacy is like one of the biggest exports out of the U.S. also. okay, and stereotypical images of African people, things like this. These are big exports, okay, out of the U.S. But anyway, so in one dark episode, two Confederate immigrants led a mob in the lynching of a police chief who refused to track down escaped slaves, in front of his family. He was killed in front of his family. Okay, see, they're exporting domestic terrorism into Brazil. Let me repeat this. In one dark episode, two Confederate immigrants led a mob in lynching a police chief who had refused to track down escaped slaves, and they killed him in front of his family. The Confederados were also suspected of assassinating a Brazilian senator who supported emancipation of African slaves. Now, in 1888, Brazil became the last country in the Americas to abolish slavery, nearly a quarter century after the United States did, 23 years after the United States did. But interracial relations in the two countries, the United States and Brazil, were different. There were neither draconian racial distinctions in Brazil nor government prohibitions on intermarrying between the races. The races mixed, yielding a country of extraordinary diversity, Brazil. Over time, some Confederados adopted new opinions on race. Over time, some Confederados adopted new opinions on race. Now, Eugene C. Harter, Harter, who was raised among the Confederados, wrote in a book about the community. He said one of the changes most evidenced in the Confederados of my youth was their belief in tolerance among the races. He said this they had acquired from the Brazilians. One of the changes most evidenced in the Confederados of my youth was their belief in tolerance, their belief in the tolerance among the races. This they had acquired from the Brazilians. So for some of these Confederados, their ideas about race are going to evolve. The Confederados and their descendants assimilated and intermarried. English was largely forgotten. The towns become indistinguishable from their neighbors. Now, one of the few elements to remain was the yearly Confederate Party with its pageantry, its music, and its flag, the Confederate battle flag. Now, they go on to talk about the organization Black Union for Equality. Claudia Monteiro, Monteiro, Claudia Monteiro, president of the local Black Union for Equality, rarely paid much attention to the party, okay, that the Confederados had. And the name of that celebration is it's celebrating the Confederate States of America in Brazil. Claudia Monteiro, president of the local Black Union for Equality, said she spent 40 of her 48 years in Santa Barbara de Oyster, which is one of the towns founded by the Confederados, the former Confederates from the South here in the U.S. And to her, it was nothing more than a town quirk. It was nothing more than a town quirk. Living in Brazil, other racial issues had always seemed more pressing, including those in her own life. Like many Brazilians, she grew up identifying as Moreno, M-O-R-E-N-A, Morena, M-O-R-E-N-A, Morena, one of the many distinctions in this country's racial taxonomy, rather than the darker negra, N-E-G-R-A, negra. Now, negra, N-E-G-R-A, she was led to believe by mass media, and even in her family was, quote unquote, always ugly. Okay. Claudia Monteiro talks about how she was led to believe by mass media in Brazil and even in her family that to be negra meant that you were always ugly. Their hair, she said, their hair was ugly. Their form was ugly. She said, I did not want to be black. She's in Brazil. She said, I did not want to be black. Not until she saw the work of the photographer Sebastião Salgado did she reassess that belief that she did not want to be black, and to be negra meant that you were ugly. In his images, she said, she recognized so much beauty and dignity in the faces of Africa and Brazil that she committed herself to Black history and activism. And it's important to understand, you know, one of my teachers, Dr. Leonard Jeffrey, says whoever controls the history, whoever controls the history, whoever controls the images controls the self-esteem, the self-development, the self-worth. Okay. And, you know, if you listen to the African History Network show, I talk about how what you do for yourself, what you do to yourself, and what you allow other people to do to you and get away with is based upon what you think about yourself. What you think about yourself is based upon what you have been taught about yourself. What you've been taught about yourself is based upon everything you've read, heard, and seen about yourself. Okay. So when you control when you control the radius of a man or woman's thoughts, you control the circumference of his or her actions, because the mind can't do or teach what it doesn't know. So this deals with the control of images and media. Things like this is very powerful. And whatever is disseminated becomes imitated. Okay, so read the rest of this article here. They lost the Civil War and fled to Brazil. Their descendants refused to take down the Confederate flag. This is from July 11th, 2020, the Washington Post, written by Terrence McCoy. Okay, powerful article. This deals with a piece of history tied to Juneteenth that's not talked about. You had slave owners in Texas and other southern states that did not want to live under Union rule. They're going to flee Texas, and in some cases take their African slaves with them and go live in Cuba, which is about 90 miles away from the U.S., because Cuba did not abolish slavery to 1886. Or they take a ship, and they go on a ship, go on a boat, go to Brazil, because Brazil did not abolish slavery to 1888. How many people have heard this before? Because in all the coverage dealing with Juneteenth and the media, things like this, I ain't hear about this. In the past couple of years, I've just heard of just a very little bit about this. This article, the article that came out June 19, 2022 by Deneen L. Brown for the Washington Post, had some of the most information in it, and she also cited the article that I just showed you from July 2020. Not all enslaved Black people in Texas were freed on Juneteenth. This is what I've been saying for years. We have to really study this whole history and its context. So when we come together with Juneteenth celebrations, we can educate our people. Juneteenth is an opportunity for us to give America the massive history lesson that it desperately needs, because Americans are very ignorant of history. All right. And then check out this article here from National Public Radio, NPR.org. 4 enduring myths about Juneteenth are not based on facts. This is from June 20th, 2022. The first myth: President Abraham Lincoln issued his Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863, and it's outrageous that it took 2.5 years for the news to finally reach enslaved African people in Texas. I keep hearing this. That's not historically accurate. Excuse me. So they break this down, what the facts are. Many African slaves knew about Lincoln's executive order emancipating them. The news was widely covered in Texas newspapers with an anti-abolitionist spin, and black people would have overheard white people discussing it in private and in public. Moreover, Edward T. Cotham Jr., Texas Civil War historian and author of the book Juneteenth, The Story Behind the Celebration, said that there was an incredibly sophisticated communication network among slaves in Texas. There was an incredibly sophisticated communication network among slaves in Texas. He said news like that spread like wildfire. We know some slaves knew about the emancipation even before slave owners. It did not mean anything because there was no army to enforce it. See, it took a military force. There was about 2,000 Union troops that come into Galveston, Texas, along with Major General Gordon Granger. Okay. And they are enforcing General Order Number 3, and they're taking back control of Texas from the Confederacy. They're taking physical control under Texas on behalf of the Union. All right, now, then the second myth: Major General Gordon Granger penned General Order Number 3, the Juneteenth Order, and is credited with freeing Texas slaves. The fact is, the order, which includes the powerful language, all slaves are free, and, quote, absolute equality between slaves and former slaves and former slave owners. That language was actually written by Major General Gordon Granger's staff officer, Major Frederick Emory, who hailed from an abolitionist family in free Kansas. Quote, as a crusader against slavery in Kansas, Major Frederick Emory was well versed on the subject of emancipation, writes Cotham in his Juneteenth book. Okay. Edward T. Cotham Jr. Sam Collins III, the unofficial ambassador of Juneteenth tourism in Galveston, Texas, says Major General Gordon Granger is just one of the characters in the story. He's not any great hero. Matter of fact, he was no friend of enslaved people. There are reports of Gordon Granger sending runaway slaves back to slave-holding states. Now, the third myth: Major General Gordon Granger read the Juneteenth order from a balcony to the people of Galveston, Texas, announcing that all slaves are free. Now, the fact of the matter is, according to Edward T. Cotham Jr., author of the book Juneteenth, The Story Behind the Celebration, according to him, General Gordon Granger never read the order publicly nor did any member of his staff. It would have been posted around town, particularly at places where African Americans, African people gathered, such as the Negro Church on Broadway. Okay. Broadway is the street in Galveston, Texas, where Ashton Villa is. So according to the story, he reads the General Order Number 3 from the balcony of the Ashton Villa, and that's on Broadway Street in Galveston, Texas. Okay, the Negro Church on Broadway, as Reedy Chapel AME Church was then called. Most enslaved African people in Texas learned of General Order Number 3 when the slave master called them together and read them the news. When the slave master called them together and read them the news. The fourth myth surrounding Juneteenth is that Juneteenth was basically a Texas version of the Emancipation Proclamation. Okay, now General Order Number 3, the fact is General Order Number 3 stated unequivocally all slaves are free, but it also contained patronizing language intended to appease planters or slave owners who did not want to lose their workforce. 41 words of the brief 93-word order urged enslaved people to stay put and keep working. Okay, General Order Number 3, General Order Number 3 said the freed people are advised. Let me pull this up here just a second. It said the freed people are advised to remain at their present homes and work for wages. Remain at their present homes and work for wages. They are informed that they will not be allowed to collect at military posts and that they will not be supported in idleness either there or elsewhere. That benefits the planters, the plantation owners, because now this gives them an opportunity to still have a labor force, a workforce, okay, to till the soil and things like this. This gives them the opportunity to still have a labor force. Now, Sam Collins said, quote, the last two sentences advise the freedmen to remain at their present homes. The last two sentences advise the freedmen to remain at their present homes and work for wages. So you're free, but you don't go anywhere. Now, we do know that you're going to have some that leave. You're going to have some of these African slaves who are going to, who came from other, they came from other states and they were taken in by their slave masters into Texas, and they came from Arkansas and Tennessee and Louisiana, things like this. Some of them are going to go back to where they came from. Now, Ed Cotham said, Ed Cotham Jr., author of the book Juneteenth, the story behind the celebration, he said many years later, the formerly enslaved who were interviewed for the 1930s WPA slave narratives, okay, the WPA Works Progress of America, WPA slave narratives. He said they remembered when the Freedom Paper was read to them, because you had the last of the former slaves die in the 1950s, okay. So he said that they were in the 1930s, the federal government interviewed some of these former slaves who were still alive. And they said that they remembered when the Freedom Paper was read to them. The slaveholder wanted to keep them working, but they didn't hear it that way. The slaveholder wanted to keep them working, but they did not hear it that way. Once those enslaved Africans heard, quote, all slaves are free, end quote, they said, to hell with you. That's what made the Juneteenth order so memorable and made it succeed, end quote. This is according to Ed Cotham Jr. Okay, so check out this other piece. 4 enduring myths about Juneteenth are not based on facts. This is from June 20th, 2022 by John Burnett for NPR.org, National Public Radio. So be patient with me. Like I said, normally I do this from my laptop and I can show you this stuff on the screen. I'm broadcasting through Restream on my smartphone. My laptop died on me, so I'm trying to get it fixed or get it replaced or something. See what's going on, because I'm crippled without a laptop. I run my business from that, and edit video and all of our shows and everything. Okay, so hopefully you like this type of information. Follow us here on our Facebook fan page, The African History Network, The African History Network, and our YouTube channel, Michael Imhotep, IMHOTEP. Give us a thumbs up, give us a heart, give us a like on this broadcast. Okay. Support the African History Network. You can register for the online history classes that I teach. Visit our new website, theafricanhistorynetwork.com. Theafricanhistorynetwork.com is our new website. You can order my DVD lectures there. You can order to have a 2.5-hour lecture dealing with the real history of Juneteenth history, Emancipation Day, but not Independence Day. We never got our 40 acres and the mule. Dr. King's Poor People's Campaign. We're coming to get our check. I do a lot of history, Civil War history, Reconstruction, all that here. That's $10. We have it in digital download format also. You can email us at ahnshow@africanhistorynetwork.com. ahnshow@africanhistorynetwork.com. It's going in digital download format. Digital download is $5. We have my 2.5-hour lecture dealing with the real history of Tulsa, Oklahoma, and Black Wall Street, and the Greenwood District, North Tulsa. Black Wall Street from destruction to the resurrection of economic empowerment, because we rebuilt Black Wall Street, which is the business district, which started at the intersection of Greenwood, Archer, and Pine. We rebuilt it with our own dollars, and we had help from surrounding Black townships also. Okay, so we rebuilt it. Yes, I know a lot of people talk about it was burned down to the ground. A lot of it was burned, but we rebuilt it. 1926, Dr. W.B. Du Bois goes to North Tulsa, and he talks about how it's thriving again. Businesses were rebuilt, things like this. So that somehow that gets left out of the conversation. We somehow just want to talk about white people destroying what we had, but we don't talk about rebuilding it again. Okay. And then you can register for the 2 online 10-week history classes that I teach on Saturdays and Sundays. And this also helps us keep doing research, helps finance the African History Network, because I don't have billion-dollar donors or million-dollar donors that finance this. Okay, so we're supported by our people. Saturdays, normally 2 p.m. to 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. It's Ancient Kemet, the Moors, and the Ma'afa, understanding the transatlantic slave trade, what they didn't teach you in school. And on Sundays, it is from the Civil War to the Civil Rights Movement and Black Power, 1865 to 1968. So I do a PowerPoint presentation. We have book references, articles, video clips. It's very visual. There's this binder here. A couple of the articles that I share with you here for this presentation come from the online class that I do on Sundays, from the Civil War to the Civil Rights Movement and Black Power. And this is one of the binders, 2 binders of information that I teach from. This is part of the curriculum. I put all this together myself. I'm a historian. I've been studying 30 years. So this is all, I put all this together. We started in 1803 with the Louisiana Purchase for the Sunday class. The Louisiana Purchase and the Haitian Revolution, because those 2 events are related. And then we go